Hi, this is Dan Korver, pastor here at Dalton Hill Baptist Church. We're a small Baptist church located in Owasso, Oklahoma. We're small enough to know you, but we're big enough to serve you and for you to serve as well. Our vision is to rescue, restore, and return to service. Rescue a non-believer or a believer who has been hurt or is lost, restoring them to Christ in fellowship with other believers with the desire that they in turn will help others along their way.
We've been starting at that new series a little bit on the heroes and villains, and we covered three of the kings in the Old Testament that were reformers, and each one did a lot of good things, but each one had things where they messed up. Some of it was pride, some of it was other things, which we'll review in a week or so. Today, though, I'd like to switch gears just a little bit. On Wednesday night, we'll do a hero and villain, but on Wednesday night, we've been talking a little bit about no little people. You look at Scripture and you see Paul's letters, and you'll often find a name that's mentioned and not much is said about them, but when you look at them, you find how important they were to the ministry. So today, I'd like to look at a couple of unexpected heroes in Scripture in the Old Testament, and just how important a part they played, but you wouldn't normally have thought that they would be the hero that took place. Let me give you some names of our own history or world history. See what you know who these people are. Katherine Johnson. How about Dorothy Vaughan? How about Mary Jackson? You know who Elizabeth Friedman? What? How many of you know who Maureen Sweeney was? All of those played an incredible part in history, world history, and in U.S. history. The first three, if you've seen the movie Hidden Figures, were the three black ladies who really helped with NASA so terrible much. In fact, John Glenn even wanted the figures checked by Catherine because she was so good with it, but you don't ever hear their names mentioned. You had the Elizabeth Friedman. During World War II, we had the U.S. Army and Navy had over 10,000 code breakers. She and her husband were the two that were the main ones that did the code breaking of Germany, and one of Germany and the other spouse did of Japan, and did the code breaking that saved thousands and thousands of lives. But she was never allowed to tell her family. Nobody knew until afterward just how important she was to it. The last one, Maureen Sweeney, she's the forecaster in Ireland that basically said you got a storm coming, you need to postpone D-Day, which they did, and said when it was going to clear, and that's when we invaded. And if they had invaded on the scheduled day, it would have been a monsoons, and the results would have changed. How important are those people? You think about just how important those people are. We have the same in Scripture, people who we don't think much about, but we're so important. And the reason I'm bringing it up too is because a lot of us are those type of individuals who have a tremendous part. So let's look at it. We'll look at the background. We'll be in Judges. And you'll see, first of all, the background politically, the background that you have. And for the sake of time, I'll cover parts of it I'll just tell you. But in Judges chapter 1, you'll find a phrase repeated over and over again. You'll find it in 20, 29, 30, 31, and so on. Each one of the tribes, it'll say, they didn't completely drive them out. Each time, they didn't drive them out. They then also would make treaties, forced labor, whatever. God had told them in the previous, do not make any type of treaty with or a covenant with foreign people, because they're going to bring their gods in, and what's going to happen. So they were told not to do it, but they failed to do it, and they brought them in. You also, because they failed, if you know the book of Judges, they're going to go a cycle. They're going to basically sin and go in this political cycle. If you remember earlier in Judges 3, you had Ehud. If you remember, he rescued them. He was the left-handed judge. Interesting, only one that talked about which hand he was, but he was left-handed. And he rescued them from the Moabites. Shamgar came in and he rescued them from the Philistines. So I think what happens then, if you think about it, if you look at the different map, if you made this, the up top would be the Sea of Galilee, Dead Sea, this would be the River Jordan. Philistines are over here, Canaanites are up here, Amorites are over here, Moabites are down here. So God would bring different people in order to then punish the children of Israel for being disobedient. So when you look at it, it kind of helps you know where they were coming from. Well, what should happen is during this time frame, the Canaanites then were basically controlled everything, controlled all the trade routes. So what happens too, how many of you know who the Kenites are? Kenite. That's Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, was a Canaanite. Okay, so they would have lived basically up this direction up over here. And when you look at the story, Heber, which was a relative, was married to a woman by the name of Jael. And he was neutral. He was not against Israel, and he was at peace with the Canaanites, so he was okay. Neutral. So that helps you when you think about being in a neutral, got along with both sides, nothing's happened. So that gives you a little bit about the background. Now, spiritually, you'll find it in chapter 2 of Judges, what was going on spiritually. And you notice in verse 2 of chapter 2, it says, don't make a covenant with anyone, which they failed. Verse 3, God says, because you did that, I will not drive them out, and they're not going to be a snare to you. And they were a snare in the fact that their gods would be a snare. If you go a little bit further, you'll notice in chapter 3 also, you'll notice in verse 1, he leaves some of the nations, God does, to teach them how to fight. If you're always at peace, when somebody comes to attack you, you will not know how to fight because you never had to. But you'll notice also in verse 4 of chapter 3, they were testing Israel, this is talking about the nations, the Philistines and so on, Canaanites in verse 3, to find out if they would obey the commandments of God which he commanded their fathers. The sons of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters for themselves as wives, gave their daughters and their sons, and served their gods. They were in the midst to test them, and they failed. Because of it, then God would then bring these different judgments, these cycles. And they would go very low, and then they would cry to God, and God would bring them up with a judge until they would leave. And it's interesting, it would work, but notice in verse 19 of chapter 2. It came about, remember the judge was there, they'd do well. It came about when the judge would die, they would turn back and act, what does it say? Worse than they did before. New judge comes along, and they go back and be worse. And so on. So it gives you the spiritual background that they had. So politically, they had trouble, and spiritually as well. So that takes us into the present setting of chapter 4. In chapter 4, you'll have a choice. Notice what it says in verse 1. The sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud. Remember, Ehud was the judge who rescued them from the Moabites. So they go ahead and they fail again. And notice it's interesting in verse 2 then what happens, the consequences. The Lord sold them into their hand. Now if you were the Canaanites, would you think the Lord had anything to do with it? No, we're more powerful. The Lord freed them out of slavery in Egypt. And because they have failed, he now has done what? He sold them and put them back into slavery, trying to teach them. And notice it's during Jabin, which is of Canaan, was over it, and Sisera was his commander. It's interesting then, notice in verse 3, the sons of Israel cried to the Lord, for he had, talking about Sisera, 900 iron chariots. He oppressed the sons of Israel, and notice the next word. Severely. You notice that earlier they would be under oppression, and this time they add the word severely. So for 20 years, they're under oppression. When you look at the song a little bit later, you'll also find that the highways, for instance, in chapter 5, notice in verse 6, it says, the day of Shamgar, remember he's the one that fled him from the Philistines, the son of Anak, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted, the travelers went by roundabout ways. Canaan controlled all the roads. That's the main trail route would go through there from India all the way up into Asia and Asia Minor and then all into Europe. So they controlled everything. So Israel couldn't take the main roads. They'd have to do what? Take a little side road, a lot more difficult to go around their own country because of it. So that tells us a little bit about it. So notice then what happens. They cry out, and notice then who God raises up, an unexpected hero. First of all, in verse 4, now Deborah, prophetess, and notice his wife, was judging Israel at the time. Okay, obviously, it's the only female judge that we find in Scripture. Could have been more, but only one mentioned. And she used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah, which would be to the north, and Bethel, which would be to the south, in the hill country of Ephraim, which would be quite a bit south of there, from where this is taking place. And the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. So she's a prophetess, she's a judge, and people would come and she would then settle their disputes. So that gives you kind of the background when you stop and you think about it. Just think about this for our own self. What's our present political setting like in our country? What's our present spiritual setting like in our country? And what is our personal setting like? A lot of similarities is taking place. So notice then the story and the call that you have. It's going to happen in verse 6 and 7. I want you to think about, answer these 5 questions for me. Who, and anytime you do anything you want to answer these questions, but who, what, when, where, you have why, and you have how. So let's look at it. So here's, you notice that Deborah, she's a prophetess of God. She sent and summons Barak. And notice where he's from. He talks about Noam and Kadesh, Naphtali, which that would be up north. Those are the tribes. That's the tribes that are up north. So if the Sea of Galilee, on the map, if you would then look a little bit to the right of the Sea of the Galilee and then to the west, that's the tribes that are up there. That's also where Canaan's at. So she then goes to him. Notice what she says to him. Right? Put yourself in his position. She comes up to you and she says, go and march to Mount Tabor and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and Zebulun. Those are 2 tribes to the north. And I'm going to draw out Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots. Remember how many? 900. To the river, as many troops to the river Kishon, and I'll give him into your hand. Okay, does the question, who was it answered? Went to Barak, right?
Yeah.
Was what answered? Was where answered? Was why answered? What about how?
You do it.
Does God say how He's going to do it? Now I want you to think about it. You're up in the mountain, up high. That's a great place to be if you're fighting. You only have 10,000, and if you get in chapter 5, they only had 40,000 available, but only 10,000 come. 4 of the tribes refused to come, which they are going to be reprimanded for. So you have 10,000. You're up high. The valley is down below, the river valley. This time of year, it's the dry time of the year. If you are in the chariot, what would you like? Would you want wet or would you want dry?
Dry.
So how much sense is that going to be if God sent through Deborah? Remember, you didn't hear it. God's talking to you and tells Deborah, and Deborah comes up to you, Glenn, and says, take 10,000, and I want you to go fight in this valley down here, and they got all these superior weapons and everything else, and you don't, if you look in chapter 5, they did not own a sword or a spear, and no chariot, and I want you to go fight. And how many of you have grown up thought Barak was just some weak, sissy type guy? You realize in Hebrews 11:32, he's in the faith chapter. That would take tremendous faith to go, to do it. But what requirement does he ask? How is not told. God does not say. He just says, I'm going to give them to you. He doesn't say how. How of you would like to know the how before you went? He doesn't say how. You're just supposed to go. I think it's interesting when you look at it. So obviously then what he does, then he has a condition in verse 8. Barak says to her, remember Deborah? If you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go, I will not go. Now think about it, if you're Deborah. Do you think you're, how many women prophetess are used to battle? And if you're the enemy, who's the very first person you'd want to take out? If she's the one that's behind it, you take out the leader. The same thing we saw last week. What do they want to do? You take out the king. It's like you hear in military, cut off the snake's head, and what happens? You take out the leadership, and it's over with. Now, how would you like to say, okay, do you believe the message enough to go? If you're Deborah. Barak basically believes that God's only working through her, and she has to be there, which obviously is not the case. Same thing happened with Jesus. You remember when he healed the people? And he healed the one, remember the young girl? And he says, you don't need to come. And God healed him on the way. Healed him. And so I think it's important to recognize that what you have with Barak, he's saying, I will only go if you go with me. Now that's a long journey too. We don't know what her age is or anything else. She goes, and you are going to be a prime target if you go. Unsung hero that you have. So notice then he says he's going to draw him out. Now when you look at it, so she goes, and notice in verse 9 what she says to him is going to happen. She said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the honor shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take. For the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. And Barak would say, what woman do you think he thinks is going to get that? Deborah. You're thinking, okay, that's fine. If you come with me, I don't. That's fine. A woman can have the glory. I'm sure you can have it. No problem. That's not who he's going to use, but that's what he's thinking. So you stop and know they both leave to go. How many of us would have gone? You're not told how. A far superior army. By the way, do you realize 225 years ago this exact same battle happened again? And the exact same thing happened that God did. Do you realize that? Same valley, same thing. Only there's two foreign nations fighting. If you want to know what happens, it's actually in chapter 5 how God does it. Let's look at it. And you have, so here you have the fulfillment. Now he has to give us back a little bit. It's in verse 10. You're going to have the conclusion that's going to happen. First of all, I'll give you the preparation that you have in verse. You have on these different things. The challenge goes out. The conclusion. And notice in verse 14 that you have 14 and 15. That you have basically Barak takes his men in verse 10, and it's 10,000 with Deborah, and they go up there. And then notice in verse 12, Sisera hears about it. So Sisera, with all these verse 13s, here Sisera called together all his chariots, 900 iron chariots, and all the people. We don't know how many thousands that was. Deborah said to Barak, arise, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Behold, the Lord has gone out before you. So Barak went down from the mountain with his 10,000 men. All right. God, she says, God's given him in your hands. He's gone before you. How did God go before him? It doesn't tell you in this chapter, but it does in the next. If you are, think about it, you don't know if you are the 10,000 and you are the, when you think about it, and you're thinking, you're Barak. And she says, God's given me your hands. Leave your high land, your high position, and go down into the valley, which who has the advantage in the valley? People with chariots, spears, swords, and you're going to go down. How many of you are going to go? If you go to chapter 5, it tells you how it happened. The stars fought from the heaven, their courses they fought against Sisera. The torrent of Kishon swept them away, the ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon. God sends rain, a torrential rain. Not the normal time you get rain. You send a ton of rain into a valley that's dry. What's going to happen to the chariots? They're going to get stuck. Everything's going to happen. They can't go anywhere. When he leaves up top, he doesn't know that. God sends the rain. The chariots are useless. They can't go anywhere. Napoleon had the same thing happen when he fought the Turks 225 years ago. God sent the torrential rains, and the Turks could not move, and Napoleon won. Napoleon never gave God the credit. But that's what takes place. So think about it. Here you have it. So notice then what's happening. Come down and notice in verse 15 back in chapter 4. The Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. Sisera alighted from his chariot. Remember, it's stuck. So he jumps out. And he takes off running. The great commander, fear of everyone, the great army that they have. And he takes off running, and notice the rest of them, there wasn't any left. God brings about a great victory. But as long as you have the general, he gets away, what's he going to do? He would go back and gather more forces and come back. So notice what he does then. He flees what he believes to be a neutral territory in verse 17. You remember in verse 11, Heber the Kenite was at neutral terms. In 17, Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for they were at peace between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. So he flees to neutral territory. Now what are you going to do if you're Jael? You think he's a fairly well knowledgeable in fighting and everything else? What type of match is Jael going to be with him? Who has the weapons? Who doesn't? Now in that day and age, women were the ones who set up tents. So would she know how to set up a tent? Would she know how to drive a stake tent? Would she know where they're at? So let's see what happens. We know what's going to happen. Notice what she says in 18. Remember, they're supposed to be neutral, but again, Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my master, turn aside. Don't be afraid." He turned aside to her in the tent. She covered him with a rug. He said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I'm thirsty." So she opened a bottle of milk and gave him milk to drink, and she covered him up. The milk would probably be something like yogurt because of the heat and so on. Because it'll tell you in chapter 5 it was curdled, so more than likely it'd be. What happens if you drink a lot of milk and you're tired?
Go to sleep.
You go to sleep. And it says he was utterly exhausted. And he thinks he's in neutral territory, and you'll notice in 20 he tells her, if anybody comes by, say there's nobody here. So in his mind, I'm in neutral territory, she's covered me up, nobody's going to know about it. I'll be fine. What are you going to do? Are you going to get involved? You notice you're supposed to be at peace. But notice you think of your ancestors, they were followers of the true God, and so is Israel. And what are you going to do? God puts it on her heart to do something, and she's going to be obedient. Notice then what she does. he tells her to stand in the doorway. Notice in 21, Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg, seized a hammer in her hand, and went secretly to him, and drove the peg into his temple, and went through into the ground, for he was sound asleep, exhausted. You sneak in his tent. Do you think he has his weapons with him? Okay. He wakes up, what happens?
He doesn't wake up.
You're dead, and what happens to the peace with your family and with the rest? I think it's really interesting when you look at it. That's part of why you have the tremendous song that comes out in chapter 5 and all the praise that goes in her direction. How important was Deborah in the story? How important is Jael? Notice it's interesting, then you notice in 22, behold, as Barak was pursuing Sisera, Jael came out to meet him. Notice both times, she goes to meet Sisera. She now goes out to meet Barak and says, hey, flags him down. Hey, the one you're looking for, he's over here. You know? It's interesting when you think about it. Notice what the results are then in 23 and 24. So God subdued on that day Jabin, the king of Canaanites, before the sons of Israel. And the hands of the sons of Israel pressed heavier and heavier upon Jabin, the king of Canaan, until they destroyed Jabin, the king of Canaan. Why? How were they able to do it? Inferior army? Inferior weapons? Because they cried out to God, and God, Deborah said to go do it, but you had some obedient people that would go do it. How important were those two women in the story? If either one of them hadn't done it, what would have happened? So you think about it, it's interesting you look at it. Did Jael choose a side? I think a lot of times she chose God's side, even though it was very, very dangerous. You know, because it would stop the peace between her family and the Canaanites. The Canaanites obviously were more powerful. I think a lot of times what we do, how many of you remember watching The Sound of Music? You remember Uncle Max in The Sound of Music? You remember? He says, what does he say in the story? Go along to get along. And how many times are we told the same thing throughout our life? Go along to get along. There is a time you have to make a stand. And he was saying just go along with anybody basically to get along. And I think we need to really think about it. The chapter 5, you have the same story, only it's put out in a song. And this was often sung for about a couple hundred years during this time frame. They would do songs. For instance, with David, they had a song about David. Saul kills what? And David kills his? Okay, so they would have songs that they would do. So here they have a song, and you'll notice who wrote it. You notice in verse 7, you'll find out who wrote it. Deborah writes it. And it's interesting what happens. It basically comes down, what talks about how bad it is in verse 7 and 8. And then verse 8, notice it says, or verse 7, that peasantry ceased, they ceased in Israel. Notice, things are tough. Until I, Deborah, arose, until I rose a mother in Israel. She has to rise up to do it. How hard would it be to go tell people, go fight it? How'd you like to be the one? Did I really hear God right? God, is this really what you want them to do? It's a suicide mission if you don't deliver. There is no way. You look at with Gideon, 300 men versus that many thousands. That's a suicide mission if you're not in it. And so you think about it. You have to be 100% sure that's what God wants. And you notice it goes on. Notice why is because of verse 8. New gods were chosen, then war was in the gates. Not a shield or a spear was seen among the 40,000 in Israel. Why did they get in trouble? New gods. What kind of odds? No shield, no sword, and not near enough people to fight. And only 10,000 go. And then goes a little bit more about what's going on with Deborah and Barak, and they're singing it. And you'll notice in verse 15, who doesn't come? You notice the princes of Issachar were with Deborah. As Issachar, so was Barak. But then notice who doesn't come. You'll notice at the end of 15, Reuben doesn't come. Gilead doesn't come. Dan doesn't come. And Asher doesn't come. Those are all tribes that are up north, right in that area. Why would they not join Israel?
Right.
If Sisera wins, who's he going to take it out on? So I'd rather be under captivity right now, but how much worse will it be if I revolt and we don't succeed? So do they believe Deborah's prophecy? No. They wouldn't join. They stayed on the sidelines. Notice in verse 23, there was a city right there outside of the battle that could have helped him. Miraz, and they're being cursed because they do not help. It's very similar to David. You remember when David was fleeing twice, that one city turned him in? Because they turned to Saul and said, hey, he's over here. They did not want to side with God. And it's interesting when you have, who would you side with? Not my fight. I didn't hear God. I'm not getting involved. It's real easy to think that way. And I think it's interesting what you have. Notice again on the song, they recognize the role and the refusal of people. And obviously in 20 to 22, we find out how God does it by bringing rain. But even with the rain, who had the weapons?
The enemy.
Because of the rain, it's all chaos, and they're all jumping and running and everything else because of what's going on. And it's a perfect time then when everything's all the chaos, and God brings it in. But God didn't tell them, I'm bringing rain. He just said to go, and I'll do it. It's amazing how we saw it last week. You remember when they started singing praises of thanksgiving, then God brought about victory? How many of us are singing and thanking God for something that hadn't happened yet? Most of us say, I'll thank you when it's over with and I see the results. Interesting, you look at it. And I think it's interesting when you go down the worry that you have. It talks about in verse 24, I think it's interesting too. Most blessed of women is Jael. Most blessed. He asked for water, she gave him milk. Praising her because of what she did. A great risk that she did. 28, what you find, 28 down to 30, you find that Sisera's mother is waiting. And she's waiting, and why is it taking so long for him to come home? And she says, oh, he must have won. And they're dividing all the spoils. And obviously, she's worried because he should have been home by now. But he's not coming home because of the victory. Notice the end of verse 31. What's the last sentence? And the land was undisturbed for 40 years. They had peace, what? For 40 years. Why?
Because of some women.
Because of some women. And you'll notice also it's interesting. Go back to verse 18. Remember he had Naphtali, or he had Zebulun, then you have Naphtali. Notice it says Zebulun was a people who despised their lives even to death. How good a warrior did he have? You had some pretty good warriors to go out, and they were going after it. And that's the kind of warrior you obviously you want. So you think about it, does God keep score? Who's the one that recorded all this? Who's the one that recorded who fought? And who's the one that recorded who didn't fight? Who's the one that recorded who was obedient? Who's the one that recorded who was disobedient? Is God writing down what we're doing today? You have the book of remembrance. God writes it down. Would I fight or would I stay neutral? I think it's interesting when you look at it. How many times do you hear of somebody naming? We named our kids after a lot of individuals. But how many times did you ever hear of a young lady by the name of Janet? He's a pretty brave woman, wouldn't you say? And Deborah, right?
We'd love for you to come and visit with us and fellowship with us. We're located at 8263 North Owasso Expressway, which is on the east side of Highway 169 North, between 76th and 86th Street North. We have coffee and fellowship from 8:30 to 9 Sundays, followed by Sunday school for all ages from 9 to 9:45, and our Sunday morning worship service is from 10 to 11. We likewise have a Wednesday night service for all ages from 7 to 8. Now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times, and in every way the Lord be with you all the time.